earlier this week, I talked about the Progressive Caucus and this letter that they sent and all of the venom that they received after they put this letter out, so much so that Congresswoman Jayapal, who is the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, had to backtrack. The letter obviously was written a little earlier this year. For some reason, it did not go out in June or July. It went out just recently, and the neoliberals could not wait to pounce on the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And for all of that heat that they received about, and everything that you're doing, President Biden, because they lauded everything, all the stuff that you're doing, we're for it. We voted for all of the funding that we have passed heretofore to go to our sisters and brothers and our family and friends in the Ukraine. We want a path to diplomacy, though, along with that. All of the hell that they caused, so much so they had to retract the letter. And lo and behold, President Obama pretty much articulated the same thing that the Congressional Progressive Caucus did. Let's take a look at this headline, shall we? Obama already said some of what the Progressive Caucus got slammed for about the Ukraine. So on Monday, 30 members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, all Democrats, released a letter to President Joe Biden about the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. They just want to put a finer point on democracy, that's all. And here's what the letter said in part. Given the destruction created by this war for Ukraine and the world, as well as the risk of catastrophic escalation, we also believe it is in the interest of Ukraine, the United States, and the world to avoid a prolonged conflict. For this reason, we urge you to pair the military and economic support the United States has provided to Ukraine with a proactive diplomatic push, redoubling efforts to seek a realistic framework for a ceasefire. Wasn't nothing wrong with that. What was wrong with that? Nothing was wrong with that. Now here's what Cole Pink, my dear Benjamin, had to say about the retraction of the letter.
Never thought I would be in a position to see how the call for diplomacy is treated as heresy, as treacherous, as giving in to Putin, as not supporting Ukraine. It's just amazing that they are so fearful of any dissent within the Democratic Party. And I probably shouldn't even use that word dissent, because that letter, if you read that letter, that was the mildest of letters. It started out with all kinds of praise for Biden, how great he's been, how Congress has been so supportive, giving military aid. And then it merely said, we should pair that with proactive diplomacy. That's all it said.
We should pair that with proactive diplomacy. That is the right thing to do, as in the correct thing to do, as in the humanitarian thing to do, as in the let's avoid WW3 at all costs. That's what that was about. And so now we have an interview came out that on Pod Save America, the interview with President Barack Obama. He was asked about the crisis in the Ukraine, how Americans are very supportive of our efforts to help our sisters and brothers and our family and friends in Ukraine. And also that people are fearful that this will continue to go on and fearful that it will escalate to something more deadly. And this is what the president had to say. I think what the Ukrainian people have accomplished is extraordinary. We do, however, have to be clear and honest with them about what we can and cannot do. And there are lines that we have to determine internally, the US, NATO, and others, that take into account the risk of tipping into a Russia-US NATO conflict as opposed to a Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, that's what President Obama said. And what he is saying is absolutely correct. It is absolutely reasonable to say, first of all, we're gonna lift up the Ukrainian people. And then secondly, though, we gotta do some soul searching here. And we gotta make it crystal clear about what we can and cannot do. We must make it crystal clear about what these alliances can and cannot do. And we must be crystal clear as to not move this from a Ukrainian-Russian battle to one that is worldwide. Now, that is what the former president said. Is it reasonable? You damn right it's reasonable. Let's go on. The president also had this to say. Probably the thing that I'm concerned about, and this is President Obama, and I'm concerned about the same damn thing. This is what the president said. Probably the thing that I'm most concerned about is that lines of communications between the White House and the Kremlin are probably as weak as they have been in a very long time. Even in some of the lowest points of the Cold War, there was still a sense of the ability to pick up the phone and work through diplomatic channels to send clear signals. And a lot of that is broken down. And I don't think it's the fault of the administration. So the president is saying, at the worst moments during the height of the Cold War, folks could still pick up the phone and talk to each other. You would think that you would want two superpowers to talk to one another. You would think that you would want two powers who have nuclear weapons to be able to tamp it down, baby. Tamp it down and to be able to talk to one another. The president went on to say, hey, I don't think it's our administration. I think it has a lot to do with Putin, but we need to work on this. And then the president said this. I think that we're now dealing with a type of Russian regime that is actually even more centralized, even more isolated and closed off. I think Russian President Vladimir Putin has consolidated decision-making to a degree that we haven't seen even during the Soviet era, and I think creates some dangers. And us finding ways in which some of that communication can be reestablished, I think is important. President Barack Obama laying it down, and everything he said in this case is not only reasonable from a geopolitical perspective, it is reasonable and righteous from a human perspective. Like, let's save humanity perspective. Ben, jump in real quick. I know we're almost out of time for this block, but your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, really the most frustrating part about this is where the business interests lie. Because fundamentally, if you look at the business press right now, they're celebrating, they're ecstatic. They want this war to last as long as possible because they're making huge profits in combination with the price gouging that this, Ukraine war that they're using as an excuse for price gouging. There's also the reality that the higher the cost of living is in Europe, right, with gas prices and things like that the way they are, the more manufacturing is moving from European countries to the United States. And so fundamentally, the business press and the business interests want this to be a prolonged war. They don't want peace, they don't want safety, they want instability. And if you look at a report that The Intercept had actually a few days ago, they pointed out that the CIA thought that Russia would completely take over Ukraine very shortly, and that they would have a long-term counterinsurgency operation within Ukraine. And so fundamentally, what is the business interest in all of this? It seems like business interests fundamentally just wanted an incredibly long, deadly conflict in Ukraine and not peace.
Yeah, and funding that war machine, all of the folks who make billions of dollars on war. So Ben, absolutely. I want to draw a voice in as we wrap this segment up from the past, and that's President Eisenhower. Let's put up what the president said about this kind of stuff. He said, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. Amen, President Eisenhower. We are resurrecting those comments. Amen.